But we've invited tonight Matthew Ho to speak to us on this speech and its relationship to the peace movement today. And I want to just say a few words of introduction about Matthew. Matthew Ho is the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network, an organization of expert former military, intelligence, and civilian national security officials who seek to reach broad, cross-partisan audiences in diverse media outlets and among the American people, who increasingly sense that U.S. foreign policy today is not making them or the world safer. Matthew is a former military captain, Afghanistan State Department officer, 100% disabled Iraq war veteran, and a Senior Fellow Emeritus with the Center for International Policy. After Matthew's comments, we will have an opportunity to have some question and answer and discussion involving the audience. So thank you for coming, and Matthew, thank you, and turn it over to you. You have to unmute.
There we go. Thanks, Marty, and thanks, Mar, and thanks everyone for coming to this. I don't know how many of you all have heard that before. I imagine most of you have multiple times. A lot of you probably watched the episode that Marty and Mar did with Jeff Sachs a month or so ago, where he discussed, and of course, Jeff Sachs has written a book on this speech, and it's an amazing speech. It's a speech that I think resounds probably with everyone here. I think it's a speech I've heard people say this. I think Marty said this to me as well, that every time they read the speech, every time they listen to the speech, they get something out of it. There's something different that stands out to them. It's a speech so replete with a narrative, a structure, a melody to it, but something that is, synchronized with a practical lecture. So I think for many of us, we're touched by it in multiple ways, whether it is that melody, the beauty of it, the poetic beauty of it. I feel his word choice, whether it's the emotion, what he's talking about, the historical memories it brings up, or for me, coming into this and just looking at the speech again and think about what I wanted to say, particularly in relation, to today's peace movement. And so I really got struck by the first part, the first third of it, and including his entry, which we couldn't hear in that video, but where he just talks about the school, because this is, and if you all remember, it's a commencement address, right? It's at American University 60 years ago and 1 month to the day. And so he has an aspect to this, a educational or informative or a professorial aspect to this, where he explains what peace is and what is the nature of peace in a way that is not emotional, but in a way that's practical. And something I think that's what I took out of this in terms of relation to our current peace movement. And I want to caveat that, of course, is I've been in the peace movement for 13 years or so, and I know a lot of you have much more experience. So I look forward to getting your thoughts on this, how this speech relates to today's peace movement and what we can take out of it in relation to how we see this movement, the goods and, of course, the bads. But, getting back to the speech, one of the things that I hadn't caught this before, I just always glazed over the first few paragraphs because the president is being nice and he's saying, thank you, Chancellor, for having us here. Thank you for, congratulations to students, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't realize how important, though, the beginning was to understanding, I think, his overall instruction here, particularly in this first part. That peace is the antithetical to ignorance, right? Peace is that rational ends, the necessary rational ends of rational men. So, but this beginning here, I didn't I didn't get this until I went back over this again. This idea how connected that defeat of ignorance is, that opportunity for peace, with the necessary needs of a university, of education. And I think if you read through this, you extrapolate from there this idea of institutions and how JFK very much ties the nature, the practical reality of peace with a need for institutions that evolve. So I want to go back though to some of the things I highlighted when I went through here, and particularly, so once he ends that section on the universities, and the role of universities, important universities, he says there are few earthly things more beautiful than a university. He quotes John Masefield, right? So, I mean, he's laying it on, but then he goes right into it. And so he says, because he admired the splendid beauty of the university, he said, because it was a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. And if you listen to the speech again, there are certain words that you catch that he says over and over again. And one of those is ignorance. And here, within the next sentence, he uses the word ignorance again, which a lot of speech writers would never do, right? But this is the meaning of what he's getting at, that peace is the antithetical of ignorance. And so he then goes on from there. He says, I have therefore chosen this time and this place, this university, right, and all the meanings of a university, as he just explained, to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived. Yet it is the most topic on earth, world peace. So this is what I get to when I think about how does this relate to the current movement, and our presence as educators. I'm a advisory board member for Veterans for Peace. Many of you on here are members or associate members of Veterans for Peace. And the mission statement of Veterans for Peace is to educate about the true cost of war. Educate is the verb that dominates the mission statement of Veterans for Peace. And I think that's the same way in the peace movement. I was blessed for a number of years to be in DC and to work with various peace groups on the Hill lobbying for peace. So Peace Action, of course, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Code Pink, Council for a Livable World, a number of these organizations where you had a presence on the Hill and you had lobbyists for peace, which is, I think, one of the things that when we try and understand what it is that we need to do as a movement, we have to look at what we are up against, the opposition that we're up against, how that is organic, how that evolves, which is another word that JFK uses a number of times in the speech, is evolve. And he puts those together at one point with evolving institutions, right? So it's really, quite remarkable where he sees this understanding of what peace is, what he sees it as, where it comes from, and then how not only do you have to teach it, you have to lead it, you have to then establish it, right? And upon establishing it, then you have to bolster it, and then you have to act, you have to expand. And of course, that's what's amazing about the speech is it's a speech in three parts. He's got this first part that I'm talking about, but then he goes on to talk about enacting a test ban treaty, right? About dialogue with the Soviet Union. So of putting into action, what he believes, the practical need for peace, and then with the institutions he's established, being able to do these things. And I saw someone in the chat note about how important the UN was to President Kennedy and the need for a UN and the reasons why. But as getting ahead of myself here, but because the idea though that he builds about this first part, the teaching, the leading, the educating, he establishes that, again, this is antithetical to ignorance, and everything that what he tries to explain is that, peace is not just the practical alternative, but it's what is attainable. And he goes through this. First, he justifies it. My favorite passage in the speech, my favorite sentence in the speech, where he says, "I speak of peace, therefore, as a necessary, rational end of rational men." Again, the antithetical to ignorance. He goes on later on, he says, "Every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward." So not only is he going antithetical on the ignorance, right? He's broaching into wisdom now, right? This idea is that not only is there a practical, attainable, secular reality of peace, but there also is too this peace that you have to find within. I mean, maybe he goes into explain, he then goes on to explain how we delude ourselves, how we see things as not being possible that are possible. And then, of course, he says, the dangerous defeatist belief that war is inevitable, right? And that mankind is doomed and that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. And I mean, how many, I think what I'm saying here is kind of obvious in the sense that those words, you could put that on a poll and go around the country, and how many people would agree with that sentiment? That mankind is doomed, war is inevitable, we're gripped by forces we cannot control. So, but what he says, though, to counter all this, again, it's building on the antithetical to ignorance, is that our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, right? I mean, so it's oops, excuse me. It's, very clear what he's saying here, very clear what this lecture is he's giving, the teaching he's giving to his students. And I have to wonder, and I know it would be the case now, if you went to an American university now and received a speech on foreign policy, we all know this would not be the speech you would receive. And the instruction like this, a speech like this, would be heretical in most major universities, particularly a lot of our schools in the Northeast and plenty of the schools in Massachusetts, where most of you all are at. So he has to, though, continue to push this idea, though, that peace is not just, again, a practical alternative, but it's accessible. It's practically accessible. And that's exactly what he says. He says, "Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements, which are in the interest of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace may be the product of many nations, a sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems." He finishes up this part by saying, "So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable." So, coming to this idea of what can we be doing as a peace movement? What should we be taking away? And then, of course, again, there's two other sections of that speech where he talks about enacting things, about taking action, about getting things done. And of course, he announces the test ban treaty. He announces talks with Khrushchev. So he's demonstrating in that speech what's possible. So we hear 60 years on, 60 years and 1 month on, and what does this speech tell us in the sense of what are we doing right and what are we missing? And I think that what we have is a penetration problem, in a sense that we are doing many things right as a group, many things right as a movement, many things right as a community. And we are just running up against a Leviathan. We're running up against the wall that we don't have the ability to get through. So I think we have the people who are doing all the hard work, and we have the people who are doing who are have been with this for such a long time. And then, of course, the people who are leading, and we have such tremendous leaders in the peace movement. Again, it's a penetration problem. It's about how do we get this message to others? How do we explain here that war is of the ignorant, peace is of the evolved, right? I mean, it's, however, whatever languages you want to use to describe that, but how do we get to that point where we're reaching people and talking in a mass forum? And this is no shock. This is nothing that, I'm especially keen in figuring out here. I mean, we all know this, but I think this is what's in front of us is we have this knowledge. We understand what JFK was saying. We come to this and we view it. It's not just an emotive or an emotional experience for us. It's a practical experience for us. We know what the reality of war is. We know what war brings. We know that there is no ability to create. There's no ability to build. There's no ability to develop. There's no ability to progress when there is war. There's only destruction, destruction, destruction. And we know this. So we know the practical side. We know that the parts that JFK was talking about why we oppose this. And this is why we can go into discussions and conversations and be objective, of not take a side, of not be emotionally invested, of not be partisan, but be principled. I think this aspect of keeping the emotion out, keep denying our attachments that we have developed politically, ideologically, romantically, if you will, that we have to realize that those are not going to help us in the sense of attaining a practical, attaining a practical peace. Excuse me. So this idea of being more secular, if you will, in our work, of coming as more evidence-based, as being more scientific than poetic, than compassionate, right? Being godly, being however you want to describe what brings you personally into the movement. So I think this is a point that, I took away. And one thing I wanted to bring up was, the aspects of how do we penetrate, how do we get to people, and then how do we present, and what are we bringing to people in terms of our reasons? Is it these this evidence-based, this explaining that war doesn't work, explaining that nothing is possible through war other than destruction, of the prospects and the possibilities that peace bring, or is it emotional, right? Is it more of an emotive? So I appreciate the ability to talk about this. It really is quite an amazing speech. I really appreciate what you all are doing at Mass Peace Action. These things are in line, right, with discussing, with educating, with informing, with providing an ability for people to discuss, right, to learn together, grow together, share together. So I appreciate what you're doing, and thank you everyone for attending, and I look forward to having a conversation.
Thank you, Matt.